Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Early Modern Asexuality and Performance, an ACMRS Roundtable. I'm Jeff Way, the Manager of Publishing Futures for ACMRS. I'm so excited to be continuing our fall series of events today with our 6 speakers, and I first want to once again extend a huge thank you to ASU's Institute for Humanities Research for their generous funding of many of our 2020-2021 digital events. I also hope those of you with us today will join us for some of our other upcoming events as well. 1 week from today, we'll be hosting Global Medievalism into African Futurism, an evening with Nedia Korafor. And even though registration is already full for this event, we will also be streaming it through our YouTube channel the day of as well, so you can still catch it that way. And then next month on November 19th, we hope you'll join us for our final ACMRS Roundtable of the fall semester, which is on the future of disability studies. And if you would like to help us in supporting more of these events, please consider going to acmrs.asu.edu/give to make a donation if you're able to do so. Originally scheduled as part of the canceled 2020 meeting of the Renaissance Society of America, we wanted to offer a virtual platform for this important and timely discussion. Though we are starting to see a greater awareness and discussion of asexuality more broadly, there has been to date little work on pre-modern asexuality studies. Today's roundtable seeks to change that. How can an understanding of asexuality and aromanticism complicate and complement figurations of celibacy, chastity, abstinence, and intimacy in early modern literature and culture? How are early modern gender and sexuality studies deepened by the theoretical tools of asexuality studies, including the distinction between sexual and romantic attraction, the idea of gray asexualities, and terms like homoromantic or allosexual? In this roundtable are 6 amazing speakers: Liza Blake, Nicholas Brush, Simone Chess, Rachel Chung, Kat Clifford, and Aley will begin to answer these questions by exploring connections between asexuality and fasting, political authority, age and adolescence, and more. Given our speakers' extensive list of accomplishments, I won't spend time today reading their bios, but we have made them available on our website, and I encourage you to find them there. As always, today's event will be live captioned, and if you want to take advantage of those captions, just click the CC button on the bottom of your screen. You can also pose questions to today's speaker through the Q&A button on Zoom. And as always, we encourage live tweeting today's event using the ACMRS events hashtag. In the first part of today's event, we're going to hear briefly from each of our speakers as they deliver a short talk. And then from there, we're going to open up the conversation to your questions. So please ask them as they come to you along the way. Now I'm excited to turn it over to today's first speaker, Aley.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to Ayana and Leah and everyone at ACMRS for adopting our roundtable. I'm going to start us off here with a presentation on, if I can remember how to do this, there we go, on some background of the state of the field. So as a field, asexuality studies is a challenge to heterosexism, even within queer studies. Our research builds on the work of queer theory, disability studies, and critical race theory to examine the origins and impacts of social norms and cultural beliefs about sex. Asexuality studies contributes to the study of sexuality primarily through the concept of compulsory sexuality, the social norms and practices that enforce the presumption that all people can and should experience sexual attraction. Relatedly, matronormativity describes compulsory sexuality through a wider lens, one that encompasses the social privileging of monogamy, marriage, and romantic coupling in addition to sex. Sexual liberation, including asexual liberation, is impossible without the work of critical race studies. Marriage, biological family, and romantic love are naturalized by white supremacy, settler colonialism, and industrial capitalism. Too much and too little sex in the quote-unquote wrong bodies have been used to justify white supremacy, eugenics, colonization, and other violence against Black, brown, disabled, and feminized bodies. We see this at the end of Richard III, where Shakespeare creates a powerful myth through sexualized images. Peace is won not through the disfigured Richard, but the virile Henry Tudor. Fertile English women are made synonymous with fertile English land, creating and sustaining an English national identity. So far, most research on asexuality has occurred outside of early modern studies. But so many of the sexual ideals and preoccupations of white Western culture today have their roots in early modernity. In 1972, the Asexual Manifesto identified the patriarchy's strongest myths around sexuality. Many of these myths originate in the Protestant marriage culture and its role in forming English national identity. For instance, myth number 1 was crucial to the success of the English Reformation and the Tudor state. Theater promulgated the belief that Catholic celibacy inherently led to English society's worst sexual fears: rape, sodomy, orgy, and simple extramarital sex. Anti-celibacy propaganda privileged those who married, and married life became the expected path of all people. This expectation of marriage led to the idealization of romantic love and companionate marriage. Both gained widespread acceptance in early modernity. There's a reason that Shakespeare's comedies end in marriage. Protestantism acknowledged the theoretical existence of lifelong virgins, but a person blessed with the gift of celibacy was so rare as to be non-existent. In Love's Labour's Lost, even the temporary vow taken by the Kingdom of Navarre is doomed to failure because celibacy was thought to be functionally impossible. English culture became so suspicious of the intentionally virgin woman in particular that she represented a radical challenge to society. Elizabeth accepted, and I'm happy to talk about that later. Within literary and performance studies, asexual reading methods observe resonances with asexual experiences. We read at face value Moll Cutpurse's skepticism that she would even like marriage. We ask how Hamlet's declaration that man delights not me, no, nor woman neither, informs his aversion to the sex he imagines others have in the Danish court. One of the biggest challenges in asexuality studies has been the fact that asexuality is defined by what it is not sexual. How do we read for absence? One solution is to embrace the queer desire of absence, but a different solution is to reframe the sexual's relationship to the erotic. Combining Plato and Lord, Aley argues that the sexual doesn't fuel the erotic, but rather the erotic encompasses the sexual as well as many other pleasures. And as you like it, Jaques' desire for melancholy, not marriage, is what drives his preference for the hermetic life. Like all the other characters who marry at the play's end, he gets his heart's desire and happy ending, just without sex. In asexuality studies, we're reading the past to understand the present and imagine a sexually liberated future. And I'm going to turn the conversation over to Liza Blake.
Okay, so today I'm going to ask very quickly what it might mean to do an asexual reading. And today I'm going to think about that question by doing 3 very quick A-spec passes over Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. So quick definitions. A-spec, as this slide indicates, means anything on the asexual or the aromantic spectrum. Note that asexuality does not indicate sex drive or libido, but attraction or orientation. Distinguishing between sexual and romantic attraction is sometimes called the split attraction model or differentiated attractions. And in ace communities, we will also often distinguish between platonic, sensual, and altruist attraction as well. A, gray, and demi are some of the most well-known A-spec identities, but there are hundreds more. And the A-spec community, when it garners attention at all, is often mocked or critically examined for this sort of multiplication or proliferation of identities. And here you can see just some of the flags from the 2 spectra, and I'm happy to talk a bit more in the Q&A about issues of taxonomy, biopolitics, and ace identities. So reading number 1, aspec identities might give us the vocabulary to see Beatrice and Benedict as reciprosexual recipromantics. In this optimistic reading of the play, the two characters are actually in love at the end because as reciprosexuals, they develop attraction only as a matter of reciprocation, or in the language of the play, requiting. The point here is not merely to affix an anachronistic identity to fictional characters, but to use aspec vocabularies and concepts to name the very specific structures of desire that actually drive this plot. I will also say just in passing that the play also offers us an example of alterous attraction, which is a way of naming close intimate connections outside of sexual or romantic pairings. Thinking about alterous attraction again gives us vocabularies to notice and describe networks of intimacy in ways that are often overlooked by focusing only on sexuality or on romance. So that was the optimistic aspec reading of the play, two reciprosexuals who happen to find one another. Here's the pessimistic reading, and to be honest, the one I believe in. Beatrice and Benedict are aromantics forced together by the generic expectations of comic form, among other forces, and I'll return to these other forces in a bit. This slide has definitions of what we might call more extreme versions of aromanticism. So omnia romantics, for example, don't just not experience romantic attraction themselves, they also don't want to have conversations about romantic activities. So not just personally romance repulsed, but anti-romantic. Both characters are very clear that they don't want love or relationships, but especially Benedict. Not only does he say at multiple points in the play that he wants to live as a bachelor, he also tries to divert Claudio from talking so much about Hero, and sometimes even mourns that marriage happens at all. Likewise, Beatrice. Consider the speech when she is asked to envision her ideal man. She says she won't have a man with a beard or a man without a beard. Her ideal man is one who does not exist, who cannot exist, and she wants to live among the bachelors in heaven. Does Much Ado About Nothing have a happy ending? Two characters who openly profess their aromanticism are forced into an amatonormative coupling, even as they continue to affirm to the very last second that they do not feel love for one another. The plot ends with a kiss. Peace, I will stop your mouth, Benedict says, kissing her, according to most editors, and in most modern productions, she consents to that kiss. Except, of course, that line is not spoken by Benedict. In any early printing of the play, it is spoken by her uncle, Leonato. Her uncle stops her mouth from affirming that she feels no love for Benedict, and then she never speaks again. And yet we do not analyze or perform that silence like we do Isabella's in Measure for Measure. Believe women, even aspec ones. This line is in fact the culmination of the play's central plot, and that is not a plot of suppressed love. Rather, it lays bare the mechanisms of amatonormativity that have structured the entire play, which is probably why modern editors either assign the line to Benedict or add stage directions to explain it away. It's not just that asexuality is the invisible orientation. The reception of this play has actively hidden it. This editorial history shows us that an aspec reading of the play must include not only characters, but also larger structures. Beatrice and Benedict have been forced together not only by the characters in their own play, but also by centuries of editors, readers, and theater practitioners who have essentially not stopped smushing their faces together. Just as asexual theory and aspec identities can help us to more accurately name and describe different forces of attraction, so an aspec reading must be attentive to different forces structuring textual amatonormativity. Ella Peshubuo does an excellent job of thinking about what it means to read for asexual resonances in her book Asexual Erotics, but I want to suggest that doing an asexual reading of early modern texts might also just mean, in the vocabulary of Sharon Marcus, just reading, which is to say, doing justice to text by accepting what is just there on the surface. Asexuality and aromanticism are not merely lacks or absences that we need to hunt for, they are made invisible by our refusals to see them and name them. Asexual reading offers us a chance to make queer readings queerer. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Kat.
Okay. Just a second. Okay. The central question I'm going to be asking for the next few minutes is, what does it mean to read asexually? What, in other words, are the qualities or premises of an asexual reading, and what might it look like in practice? Just as a queer reading might look to a text for its queer possibility, I want to propose that one way of reading asexually means reading for asexual possibility. To borrow from Ayla Pashibawo and Daniel Cooper, a strategy of researching queerly and asexually requires approaches to readings that start with the assertion that whenever asexuality is at the heart of literary, historical, and theoretical analysis, so is asexuality. At its essence, asexuality troubles the logic of allonormativity. Indeed, even many self-identified asexuals can attest to facing reactions of incredulity and suspicion when coming out to non-asexuals, even medical practitioners. Because psychiatry's supposed good life is conceptualized as sexual, asexuality's excess of the less symbolizes a turning away from a person's societal responsibilities of production. Thus, because of its threat to heteropatriarchy, it is often framed as a lack. Opening up a text to an asexual reading, however, offers to name the lack and problematize the master narrative of sexual normacy, to borrow from Jacinta Flore. Looking to queer theory for such a project is a natural extension of a practice grounded in dismantling heteronormativity and its assumptions. Asexuality queers the assumption that sexual attractions and desires are essential to being human. One methodology for reading a text asexually centers around what Elizabeth Hannah Hansen describes as the logic of asexuality. Treating the logic rather than the identity category in literary texts might be a more productive intellectual route than a project that seeks to out asexual characters and/or historical persons. Exhuming previously sublimated specters of asexual representation has an obvious and not insignificant value, but reading a text asexually looks to the text for its possibilities rather than its intentions. Asexuality in this sense is most nearly understood as a meta-construct rather than an identity. As such, the primary focus of reading text asexually lies in the challenging of assumptions about desire and attraction, which, as Hansen argues, are often central motivating narrative forces. So, what are narrative markers of asexuality, and in what ways do they point to an asexual logic? For a case study, I want to turn briefly to Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, a play constructed in part around assumptions of sexual and romantic attractions, and more specifically, to Feste the Clown. Of the play's main cast of characters, Feste stands apart from this sexual confusion. In the text, he seems to be neither the subject nor the object of sexual or romantic desire. Indeed, one way of reading asexuality into the play is to read Feste as an aro-ace-coded character. For evidence, we might look to the fact that even though he has the fourth most number of lines after Olivia and before Malvolio, Feste never expresses any apparent sexual or romantic interest in another character. He experiences the play's erotonormativity from the outside, commenting upon it but not apparently participating in it. His asexuality in such a reading is defined in large part by his otherness to a highly sexualized and allonormative Illyria, one where attractions create comic chaos. Feste is liberated from the trouble caused by unrequited love. To read Feste as an asexually coded character, though, means to read him for his apparent lack of sexual or romantic attraction to other characters. This begs the question of whether asexuality is best defined by this lack, or if there is a more constructive way of reading the logic of asexuality into the play. Indeed, I would argue that Feste's presence destabilizes the thematic binary of excess and self-denial that the play establishes for Morsino's famous opening lines. Thus, one way of interrogating asexual possibility in this play is to think of Feste's relationship to the bodily excesses and denials present in the sexually normative world of the play. Allonormativity, or at the very least, amatonormativity, drives the narrative, which can be seen most clearly in the marriages and engagements at the end, Viola and Orsino, Olivia and Sebastian, Sir Toby and Maria, and in the ways certain characters, Malvolio, Sir Andrew, Antonio, are excluded from romantic coupling altogether. Only Feste and Fabian emerge unscathed, liberated from both the joy and the violence of sexual and romantic couplings. To conclude, sexual normativity remains the central structure that asexuality deconstructs. To read a text asexually is to look to asexual normativity's cracks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My rather specific approach to early modern asexuality and performance lies at the crossroads between chastity and food refusal. More specifically, how early modern playwrights incorporate chastity and food refusal into their dramatic works. Reading early modern plays through this intersectional lens allows us to see how early moderns as a cultural community view these connections as they pertain to asexual performance, as previously described by my colleagues in the panel. Taking these readings even further, I seek to understand how gender identity and gender performativity play roles in chastity and food refusal, looking at how early modern men and their habits of consumption, both sexual and gastronomic, affected their bodies and their bodies' places within early modern society. Food refusal, which includes partial or total rejection of foods and/or fluids, takes many forms, some of which are conscious decisions while others are subconscious and may even be classified as disabilities. The primary form of food refusal I am concerned with is that of fasting, to, quote, abstain from all or some kinds of food or drink, especially as a religious observance. Many early modern characters openly connect fasting and chastity, as both are often considered synonymous with holiness and sexual purity. Sexual purity, though, often lies at the heart of early modern womanhood, not manhood. Chaste and pure men are often regarded with some level of suspicion, and sometimes rightfully so. Think Lord Angelo from Measure for Measure, for example. Other times, chaste, or as we might describe today as asexual, men are often ridiculed and mocked, such as Slender in Merry Wives of Windsor. Both of these characters, Angelo and Slender, are described by others as either engaging in fasting or they do so openly, front and center, even if the word fast does not appear in the text. Such is the case with Slender, who refuses to attend dinner, claims he is not hungry, and insists he shall eat nothing even if he does not mention fasting specifically. In fact, it is Simone Chess's work on Slender, discussing his asexuality and adolescence, that led me to the research I am discussing today. So even if the word fast does not appear in a text, characters still may engage in fasting or a similar form of food refusal. One point I have yet to fully explore is where the break between fasting and other forms of food refusal occur, which I do hope to find more on as I continue researching. But for the sake of brevity, today I'm going to speak only to the works of Shakespeare. A comprehensive search of 2 online Shakespeare concordances reveals 46 speeches and/or lines in which the word fast in its original form or other variations, such as fasting, occur in food and/or religion-related contexts. Of these, only 5 are spoken by women, one of which is Rosalind dressed as Ganymede, so within the play's context, there are technically only 4. Even more surprising, only 2 of these lines are spoken by women about women. All other lines are spoken by men about men, excepting 3 lines in which men speak about women and 2 which reference animals, horses and an eagle specifically. Breaking the individual lines down and counting the exact number of times the word fast shows up, we see 52 uses of the word in Shakespeare's canon as it applies to food. Of these, a play-by-play breakdown reveals that Love's Labour's Lost contains the most, at a hearty 12 uses, with the runner-up being 2 Gentlemen of Verona sitting at 5. As if the title Love's Labour's Lost is not telling enough, of even more note is that all of Love's Labour's mentions of fasting are about men. Naming conventions for characters are also important when considering fasting and asexuality. I've already mentioned Merry Wives' Slender, but Richard II's John of Gaunt provides another example of slimly named characters within Shakespeare's works. Gaunt even says that his name, quote, befits his composition, and goes on to mention various forms of fasting that have given him his slim frame. Yes, Gaunt does have many children, but keep in mind that that does not preclude any possible asexuality, as asexuals can and do reproduce. In sum, this research is still in its early stages. While I would argue the connections between fasting and chastity are relatively obvious, reading fasting as asexuality and performance, especially for men, highlights a form of dietary deviance not yet fully explored. My examination of fasting as asexuality will be included as a chapter in my forthcoming dissertation on subversive consumption in early modern drama, and I look forward to working within the greater community of early modern asexuality studies as I continue to progress. So thank you for your time, and I will pass the reins over to Rachel.
Thank you so much. That was very illuminating. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Chung. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, and I'd like to extend an enormous thanks to the ACMRS for having us today. It's really been a pleasure to get to hang out and trade ideas with such brilliant and welcoming scholars. I'm going to be chatting today about how we read asexuality and aromanticism, called ACE-ARO for short, in early modern dramas, and perhaps more importantly, why I think it's critical that we do this. I don't have a lot of time, so any forays into queer or performance theories will have to be pretty cursory. The overarching question of sorts that I hope to answer, or begin to answer, is this: what are the readable signs of ACE-ARO on stage? How does a person perform asexuality or aromanticism in a tangible way? Because ACE and ARO are primarily defined as a lack of desire, it can be difficult to represent asexuality or aromanticism on stage with a text in which it isn't explicitly mentioned. ACE and ARO are, in this way, essentially verbal in their expression on stage. The clearest way to confirm that someone is ACE or ARO is for them to say it out loud. When we're working with early modern texts, we don't usually have this exact option. Instead, characters refer vaguely to their lack of desire, not even necessarily of sexual desire, but of desire to be married. We've had some great asexual and aromantic readings of early modern characters as part of this panel. When the reception of an early modern dramatic text depends so much on subtext, how do we queer those narratives to include elements of ACE and ARO? I argue that scholars and theater makers alike are learning to use a newer class of signs, a category of signifiers aimed at expressing queer interiorities. To understand ACE and ARO as ontological identities that possess their own external signifiers, I turn to Benjamin Kahan, author of Celibacies. Kahan builds what he calls an expressive hypothesis. He says, sexuality not only must take shape in or seek what we recognize as normative sexual acts, but also must exist as a desire or fantasy before using sexual acts as its vehicle. Sexuality is internal in that it stems from a personal, invisible impulse and is externalized as behaviors. These behaviors are part of the stage space lexicon of a play. Outside of ACE and ARO, reception of on-stage sexuality depends on expression. The way that we are used to recognizing sexuality in others is outside in. Therefore, in order to perform asexuality or aromanticism on stage, actors must find ways to act ACE or ARO. Kahan references coordinates of desire, where sexuality has a discrete object and desire is vectoral. In the case of ACE and ARO characters, desire takes the opposite form, a point to desire not to marry, not to be directed toward an object or to be an object. In many early modern dramas where characters express a lack of desire, there's what Kahan calls twin etymological senses of virginity and bachelorhood. Because of the role of sex in legitimizing a marriage, a character's disinterest in marriage can be interpreted as a lack of interest in sex itself. However, because the desire to remain unmarried or virginal usually serves the plot, asexuality and aromanticism are often depicted as temporary rather than as ontological states of being. This is part of why it's important to me that we continue to do these ACE-ARO readings of early modern dramas. Because asexuality and aromanticism aren't temporary. They do exist and have always existed as immutable states of being. The performance of asexuality and aromanticism takes the form of refusal. Refusal to marry, refusal to kiss, to touch, to be touched. Even though asexuality and aromanticism stand alone as a state of being, they are most clearly acted as a response to another action. Highlighting and codifying these motions as explicitly ACE-ARO dismantles the outside-in nature of our existing sexual sign systems. It interrogates the demand that sexuality be performed according to a set of readable, consistent signs for the benefit of the reader. the visible presence of ace-aro identities on stage subverts object-focused sexuality and rejects the economy of possession that permeates sexual politics. The movement or behavior-based category of signs that support ace-aro identities fits neatly into the overarching sign system of a staged production. The inclusion of ace-aro signs on stage not only normalizes asexual and aromantic behaviors, but it normalizes those identities in day-to-day life. And with that, I will turn you over to the very capable hands of Dr. Simone Chess.
Hi, everybody. Hold on while I get this PowerPoint up. In my brief time today, I want to talk about what brought me, an allosexual ally working elsewhere in early modern queer studies, to asexuality studies, why I think engagement with asexuality studies and frameworks and methods matter for all of us in early modern studies, and where I see evidence of early modern asexuality studies emergence as an urgently needed and sustainable subfield. For me, what's most generative about the ideas of asexual activists, theorists, and community members is the specificity about what we're talking about when we're talking about relationships and sexualities. To reiterate just a few of the paradigm-shifting concepts that are basic in asexuality discourse, there's the crucial distinction between romantic and sexual attraction or repulsion. There's an articulation of arousal and libido as separate from desire or preference. There's the frank recognition of diverse spectrums for romantic and sexual identities and preferences. And as Liza's shown, there is precise terminology to help us navigate all of this. While certainly not oppositional to sex-centered queer readings, the tools of asexuality studies encourage us to locate queer articulations outside of sex acts and romantic relationships. These frameworks were what I had in mind when I first wrote about early modern asexuality in a 2018 book chapter on asexuality, queer chastity, and adolescence, with a focus on Adonis in Venus and Adonis, Slender in The Merry Wives of Windsor, and Pericles in Broom's The Antipodes. In the essay, I argue that asexual adolescent characters queer abstinence, coding it as a viable and intentional choice rather than a temporary default associated with childhood. Basically, I'm asking what it could look like if we took characters at their word when they tell us they aren't interested in having sex or engaging in romantic games. I think the essay does some good field-building work in the sense of locating possible points of asexual identification, adding these characters to a growing informal canon of early modern asexuality. But way more importantly, the essay served as a kind of asexual bat signal. While I'm definitely not the first person to work in early modern asexuality, this essay was, to my knowledge, the first or maybe second one to have asexuality in its title. And so I think it helped to legitimize this work and encourage newer and better takes that could build on it. So that's one thing I want to say about field building. The work doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to create some space. Speaking of putting work out there as a provocation, in a more recent project, I started thinking about intersections of asexuality and disability. In this piece, forthcoming in Early Modern Women, I try making the case that anorexia and asexuality are figured as mutually constitutive in both medical discourses and in dramatized representations, including Haywood's A Woman Killed with Kindness and Ford's The Broken Heart. Overlapping with Nick's work in food studies, I argue that even as it is pathologized as a disability, self-starvation in plays can function as a communication of sexual and romantic disinterest, and it enables a rare representation of asexuality as a possible choice for married women in a culture heavily oriented towards cis heterosexuality and marriage. I'm happy to talk more about either of these two essays, but I'm also eager to talk about what might be missing in them and what we should be looking for in the futures of early modern asexuality studies. One way forward is through asexual methodologies, like Aley's thinking about asexuality in genre, or Rachel's work in performance studies, or Kat's framing of asexual reading, which we'll be exploring in our upcoming SAA seminar. Another path is to keep thinking about bringing asexuality into conversation with already thriving early modern subfields, including medical history, food and animal studies, eco-criticism and indigenous studies, critical race studies, and queer and trans studies. And in solidarity with those fields, there's work to do in pushing for change in publishing and peer review systems that would say our work is ahistorical or otherwise not valid. Finally, I want to close with a reminder that the relationship between asexuality studies and early modern studies is a reciprocal one. Early modern asexuality studies has contributions to make for current discourses in ace and aro spectrum culture and theory. To name a few, we can help to correct the official timeline of asexual history so that it extends before the 19th century, not only filling in historical gaps, but also crucially undoing the reductive link between asexual identities and their clinical medicalization. We can dismantle the allocentric idea that asexuality is a new trend or a modern internet invention. We can lend cultural capital and even bardolatry to the cause, not only in superficial ways like expanding current offerings of early modern asexual merchandise, but more deeply, by authoritatively affirming asexuality's own canon and reading and interpreting it with critical strategies and methods that we are only now, today, together, starting to imagine. Thank you.
All right, as everybody jumps back on. So first, thanks to all of you for, I think, some just amazing and thought-provoking talks. And I think one thing that really kind of sticks out for me is the way that you are all starting with a spectrum and not a binary, which I appreciate. I think it opens up such vibrant ways to kind of approach this. So an opening question for, I think we have some great questions coming in now, but for all of you to kind of to build on what you've just talked about a little bit, because I think these model some really good sort of kind of initial approaches into bringing asexuality studies into early modern studies. What do you see, and I think this kind of speaks to right the end of Simone's talk, like what do you all see as sort of as some of the long-term goals of early modern asexuality studies?
I guess I'm happy to start. I mean, I think that we envisioned our papers today as not the end of a conversation, but the beginning, right? An invitation to sort of take up some of the questions that we've put out. So what we want to see is more people interested in asking these kind of questions with us. Yeah, I think that's one thing I could say.
Yeah, I would add to that too, that one of the things that we're interested in doing to touch on what Simone has already said is to sort of expand the timeline a little bit beyond how it's usually spoken about, right? I mean, even taking asexuality past this idea of it being an internet personality, an internet orientation into something that has kind of visible occurrences elsewhere is something that we're all pretty excited about, and we hope to see more expansion of the field in that direction.
I think all those ideas about representation and deepening history are really important, but I also am really inspired by Kat and by everyone's work to talk about asexual methods. And I think for me, that's really important to bring into other kinds of work. It doesn't have to be explicitly about an asexual character, to use the tools of asexuality to really clarify, are we talking about romantic attraction or sexual attraction or libido here? Are we talking about heteronormativity or heteromanticism or heterosexuality here? And I think we need that in all our conversations about gender and sexuality, not just in conversations about people or characters who might be ace. So I think for me, that's a really valuable contribution. So I'd like to see asexuality studies grow in the early modern period, but I'd also like to see its tools put to use more broadly.
It's one more tool in the toolbox of doing that political work of dismantling heterosexism, heteronormativity, and the ways in which all of those categories of oppression still operate within it.
As someone who identifies as asexual, as Simone was saying, representation is incredibly important. I came to Simone's work just by doing a library search of Shakespeare asexuality, and that was the only result. So my goal here is to make those search engines work a little bit harder and expand the representation and show that there are multiple voices and multiple approaches to asexuality studies in the period, besides just, you know, the 2 or 3 basic ones that we can open up to food studies and queer studies and all different types of fields.
Great. Yeah. The questions are coming in too, so we'll see how many we can get to in the time we have left. But I think this is a really kind of interesting one to start with. So this question, I'd love to hear more about asexuality and genre. Could reading asexually help us think of a different driver for the plot of comedy besides marriage? Are there asexual implications for ways of reading other genres?
Most of my work actually in my dissertation on asexuality is about tragedy, and the almost like the failures of narrative, or the ways in which temporality in some tragedy and like the ending of time or the ending of reproduction overlaps with, for instance, Lee Edelman's work, and how that contributes to, I'm thinking particularly of Hamlet and its own relationship, or truly COVIDian relationship to time, and how that's part of, it's another asexual reading or asexual methodology of time being nonlinear, or narrative being nonlinear, or at the very least non-production oriented, in analogous ways that, yeah, perhaps we can think about what else could make a comedy if not marriage? Is it the ability to have a satisfying, asexually erotic ending, as in As You Like It?
I think that was my favorite line, Aley, of your talk, is where you say that, you know, that's what makes a comedy, or how did you say it?
There's a reason that all of Shakespeare's comedies end in marriage.
But I think anyone who teaches Shakespeare's comedies will know that they're unsatisfying to almost everyone. You know, nobody ends thinking like, oh, thank God, that was such a great conclusion. I feel totally like that worked out. And so I like your reading and Liza's for using asexuality to sort of talk about why they're so unsatisfying, and whether there might be answers to their unsatisfying nature beyond just, well, this is a bad heterosexual match, but thinking about other ways that they're unsatisfying.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, sorry, not to take up too much time with the question and answer, but I think comedy is really useful for this type of project because of all of these reasons, right? Because if asexuality is about, if reading asexually is about kind of deconstructing sexual normativity and neuronormativity in the ways that these kind of play out at the end of a comedy, it's maybe easier to see those cracks, because I mean, I agree with Simone that whenever you teach these plays, students kind of go, that's terrible ending, right? So it's a little bit easier to kind of point to the ways that they're terrible as part of an asexual reading.
I might also add very quickly, although we were all thinking about performance today, the sort of asexual argument that I have in my heart that I really want to write is about Abraham Cooley, who begins a collection of love poetry, The Mistress, with a confession that he has never felt desire. And it's so weird to me that no one has thought about what is entailed in somebody writing a collection of love poetry that begins with an expression of anti-love. And so I think even beyond the theatrical genres, there's a lot of stuff out there still left to be explored, right? The Platonic love movement in 17th century poetry. So really expanding the number of genres we can use to think about this would be generative as well, I think.
So I just wanted to let you all know that you have inspired questions. They are coming in, and we have more than we're going to be able to get to. So I'm going to try and tie a couple together. This question, are there any tensions between queer studies and asexuality, between sex-centered queer theory, as you said, Simone, and asexuality studies? Is there a difference between the time out of joint queer temporality identified by Lee Edelman and asexual time?
Okay, at the risk of dominating the conversation, because I've thought about these things. I don't know that it's not a different of species, it's a different of breed, if I may, that we're engaged in the same kind of long-term project of evaluating how heterosexism has played out in different narrative structures, in different political structures, different cultural structures. But there are particular things within that asexuality in particular can teach us, just in the same way as there are particular things that looking through a lens of polyamory can teach us. That's why I borrowed from Elizabeth Brake. She doesn't work precisely in asexuality studies. She's more polyamory studies, but the terms overlap because the projects overlap. We have particular angles of inquiry, but they all feed into the larger knot of undoing that kind of heterosexism and allonormativity, which is its own kind of heterosexism, spicy heterosexism.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, is there tension between queer studies and asexuality? Yes, so much tension. There's, I think, a lot of aphobia in mainstream queer theory because queer theory has for a long time defined itself about sex and about sex acts and about desire. And so I think there's a perception of asexuality studies as sort of prudish and trying to ruin the fun of the party, you know, and that has not been my experience, though. I think that queer studies and asexuality studies have so many tools and ideas to lend each other, and that we get a richer sort of sex-focused queer studies when we also make space for an asexuality-focused queer studies as well. So I think there's a ton of tension and a lot of work to do, but that it's very synergetic and generative right now.
Like, I'm doing asexuality and kink studies. Like, they're not opposed to each other. They have things to say about and to each other.
And I would also say too, although I mean, what I hear is the presumption that perhaps like ace people are all anti-future and then allos are all pro-future. And of course, those are two intersecting axes, not parallel axes, right? There are ace people who can and do have families of all sorts of shapes and sizes. And there are hetero allosexual people who do not want children, right? And so it's not necessarily that those two are the same thing every time.
So this next question, I think, kind of digs a little bit more into performance too. And I was thinking back to Rachel's talk in particular. So in thinking about asexuality and performance, it feels like discussing space is really important. What spaces provide space of resistance or speak back against the compulsory heterosexuality that pervades space, even when no heterosexual is present? Can we think about a culture of asexuality in addition to reading / looking for expressions of erasure of asexuality for individuals?
I can start us off on this one. Yeah, I think that, you know, especially coming from where I come from and more of like a theater studies background, I think that the study of proxemics is going to be super important to asexuality studies and to that study of touch. I forget, was it Aeneas Nin who called touch an action that always miscarries at the last second? But this really interesting idea of touch as language and space as expression, and the way that we position our bodies both on stage and when we receive that stage picture, and the way we position our bodies in the world is in itself an expression of language. You know, this is not a new idea. Like, we say the phrase body language all the time, but I think that that's the sort of like academization, the problematization of body language as part of sexual expression and asexual expression, you know, legitimizes asexuality because the proximity of our bodies to each other is itself part of a sign system. Thanks, Aley.
Anyone else have thoughts on that? I'm curious, for me, kind of going back to, and I wonder if anybody can speak to this, or we can move on to another question, but especially the kind of the question of embodiment, right? As you were saying, Rachel, that asexuality has to be kind of a verbal cue on stage. It's not something that we can just read in the body itself. And so I think, does that present challenges? I mean, obviously it does, but how do we navigate that in performance?
Yeah, it's complicated. I'm glad you asked, because what I said isn't 100% true. It was like 10% of a lie, because like, of course you can express asexual impulses and aromantic impulses physically, you know, again, in terms of proxemics and the response. But the crux of that point really is that on stage, physical asexuality is always a response. And I want to kind of get away from that idea that asexuality is an answer to allosexuality, where asexuality and aromanticism are in and of themselves, in a vacuum, still standalone identities and standalone impulses. So does that answer the question?
I think I want to give an example here.
Yes, please do.
I'm not sure if this directly speaks to you, but I think it speaks to the larger of how do you tell the difference once you're on stage. I would not consider the David Tennant Hamlet to be an asexual performance. I would consider the Benedict Cumberbatch Hamlet to be an asexual performance. The particular cues that I read in each of them, whether they're especially in the scene with Ophelia, whether they're treating the get thee to a nunnery sincerely or sarcastically, sarcastically in the Tennant, sincerely in the Cumberbatch, I think really hinges on what is that character's relationship in that action, in that verbalization, that particular intonation that can teach us about their relationship to sex.
I guess
I would also say, I mean, we tend to think about people expressing their identity on stage, characters expressing their identity on stage in terms of monologues. Like what Rachel is saying makes me think of is maybe if we're trying to think about asexual identity, aromantic identity, it's not happening in the monologues, it's happening in the scenes where there are multiple characters interacting with one another.
I would just add that, again, we have these tools from asexuality studies that can complicate what we're talking about, where it's not so binary. It's not, is this character performing 100% asexuality, 100% aromanticism, but rather, what would it mean if the character was homoromantic but asexual? What would it mean if the character was relationship repulsed but having an erotic experience or something like that? So there's all these areas in performance that can be deepened, I think, through the tools of asexuality studies that let us break apart what we might otherwise just say is like, sexuality or something like that, and really think about what that means for any given character, whether they might fall on the aro-ase spectrum or not.
So I think we've got maybe time for one more question. So I want to throw it out there before we're at time. This question gets us a little into kind of thinking some different intersections. My question has to do with class. Given the way that so many of you have emphasized how capital shapes sexuality and heteronormativity, are there ways in which labor also shapes asexuality?
Well, if I could jump in here, I recently read a really interesting piece, it's about 20 years old, from Mary Ellen Lamb, where she was talking about Malvolio as an asexual character in Twelfth Night, and but that was like an ancillary part to the article where she's arguing that the whole thing that the Malvolio plot is kind of representing is this boundary breaking between a character who is beneath the superior, trying to marry and get with the superior, right? And that's the boundary breaking. And Malvolio is presented as asexual in part as a way to kind of like emphasize the ways that he's going beyond the bounds of what he should be doing, right? So he's sort of like punished as an asexual character. And in that case, he's like, kind of cast off at the end of the play, and he's sort of, vows to come back and have revenge, but it's kind of this like toothless ending. So I think that's a really interesting, thinking about class and labor, I think that's really interesting, right? That like, in what ways are the plays perhaps like reifying these really problematic structures about who is allowed to reproduce and who is allowed to be in these relationships, and what can that possibly mean for like the universe of the play? I think a couple of you touched on that. Aley, you touched on the reproduction thing especially.
And I think that matters too. I mean, labor is certainly part of it, an important part of it, but so is race, so is disability, right? These are all questions of not only who gets to reproduce, who gets to be coded as having desire, who is being sort of excluded from having sexuality or being set up to reproduce in meaningful ways. And so, like, yes, labor is very important, but it's also very intimately bound up with with race and with disability and with all these other things that affect the sexualities we either project onto or take away from other people.
Yeah, there were a few questions about maybe chastity or other things like that. And I think it's interesting to think about who's allowed to have kind of a normalized asexuality and say, oh, this is my white feminine chastity, you know, that I'm preserving. And for whom is that considered unnatural or not accessible? And so I think, again, like Liza said, that falls along lines of age and class and definitely race. So asexuality connects some of those ideas in really productive ways, I think.
And Sasha Garwood writes on self-starvation of English noblewomen, which really brings in, that's more on Simone, on mine and your side of the house for our current research, but it's specifically about white female English nobility, right? They're the ones who are allowed to starve themselves because other people, other races, other classes are already starving, right, for non-religious reasons. So I think that these intersections, like Liza said, of race and disability are also incredibly important. But yes, it is the rich white people who are getting the chance to be asexual because they want to be, right?
I think that's such a great point. And actually, I think we have time to kind of squeeze in one more question because you're already getting into this. We have a couple people asking a little bit more about the relationship, Aley, that you started with between critical race studies and asexuality studies. So do you want to maybe address that a little bit more?
Ooh, what's the short version of this? Yeah, as we're getting, 2 minutes, cool. So much of what has been naturalized about what we think of as sex has so much to do with the suppressed histories of, as you said, who is allowed, who is enabled, who is disabled from being able to have sex, being able to reproduce, being encouraged to reproduce, or being forced to not reproduce. And these colonial histories, these white European Christian histories around how we talk about sex, how we talk about relationships. There's really interesting work in Indigenous studies that I think overlaps very strongly with asexuality studies and polyamory studies as well. Kim Tallbear is one of the scholars I point you to that is looking at how there are different relationship structures outside of white Western Christianity that are on equal terms with typical married relationships. You can have your, what we might call in white Western society today, queer platonic relationships that were equally important as married relationships in certain Indigenous societies in the Ontario region, and that are being recovered through a lot of this queer studies, Indigenous queer studies work. And so there's great work, Ayanna Hawkins-Owen, who's looking at how asexuality as an ideal has been baked into white femininity. The idea that somebody who can sexually restrain themselves and should sexually restrain themselves to some extent is a feature of whiteness, and so asexuality has been used to sustain that kind of white supremacy. And so many of those histories have their origins in early modern studies, when colonialism was really kicking off.
Does anybody want to add on real quick? Yeah, Nathan.
Yeah, I think Aley, you said that so well. Both who, how race interpolates who gets to select to be asexual, who is desexualized through a choice not of their own, things like that. And then I'd only add that this is something contemporary asexuality studies is really grappling with right now. You know, how white it can seem, what place there is for theorists, but also just people of color in ace communities. And so I see our work as connected to those conversations too, and another kind of dovetailing between early modern asexuality studies and contemporary.
And I'll maybe just also add very quickly, so we did post on the ACMRS website a link to a bibliography, and there is some really good work already on asexuality and race on that bibliography, and there is lots of room for more of it.
And certainly hit us with your questions on Twitter. We're all active on there.
So first, thank you all. This was such a great discussion. I think I learned so much, and I think you have piqued the interest of everyone watching today. There were just way too many questions to get to in this time. So thank you. And thank you to all of you who joined us and for your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. Yes, we have the bibliography is shared and up on the ACMRS website, so definitely check that out. It's a great resource. Thank you again to all 6 of our amazing speakers today. And we hope that you will join us again next week when we have a dialogue with Nnedi Okorafor. So thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.